To begin with, thank you very much for being willing to listen to me. I think that is a great honor. I have no idea what the first slide is. I don't remember what I put together. It's in there. No, that's not me. Honor of Charlie. Apparently tonight I'm going to talk about iron ore car construction. So while they work this all out, let me explain to you. I once saw one of these lectures about iron ore cars, and somebody did little two-axle ore cars on the VNT, and there were rivets down the side. Why did this group have 11 rivets, and why did this group have 10 rivets, or whatever it was? It works like this. For those of us that have worked from drawings, it says rivets on 2-inch centers. Go ahead. So you take your compass, your dividers, and you lay it out, and it's 2 inches, but it doesn't really work out. So either you expand them because you're lazy and you don't want to drive that many rivets, or you shorten them up because it looks better. How many rivets are in there is actually just at the whim of the craftsman. So bits and pieces of VNT 17. So there it is, VNT 17.
This is my out on that side. Okay, so.
Now right behind you. Anyway, we have it. 5 years ago, this car was not a blip on the screen. It was not anything we were really paying any more attention to than any other piece of equipment.
That means I can't see.
And unfortunately, we're coming up on 150th anniversary of the driving the Golden Spike. I don't know if any of you know this, but almost 150 years ago, a bunch of guys got together in the middle of the desert and they drove a spike in the ground and they took a lot of pictures, and it was the melding of the East and the West, and it's a big deal, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, we're going to try and tell the story. You'll probably never see it again. Come on, guys, that's a joke. Everybody's talking about this. This is old friggin' news. This is really, unfortunately, boring history. It's boring history. This is boring history. They went out in the desert, they drove the Golden Spike. They've written books about it. They've made movies about it. There's a national park out there where you can go out and stand in the middle of the desert, which is actually pretty cool, and see where they did it. With all due respect to history, so what? I'm serious about this. Here's a nice piece of equipment. We know where it was built. It's pretty old in the railroad passenger car field in the United States. It's not the oldest, but it's pretty old. It was built on the West Coast. That's kind of cool. Out of West Coast materials. That's pretty cool. And one day of its pathetic life, 140 years, one day, he went to some place where a bunch of guys got together, drove a Golden Spike, drank a bunch of champagne, slapped each other in the back, and then got the hell out of there. The question that comes up is that why this car is important? Really, so, you know, my father once knew a man who shook hands with an Indian. That does not make him famous. Anyway. We have this car. And now it's a big deal. And it's going to be a big deal for about 2 years. And then we're going to have to wait 48 more years for the 200th anniversary. So I've been in this profession since 1977, doing this stuff. It's a long time. And in those, let's say 77, 87, 97, 40, 40 years. In those 40 years, we have matured in our perspective of how preservation should occur. When I entered into this field, quite by accident, we were still in the, hey, there's a train shed up somewhere in the mountains, let's go get that locomotive out and run it. Let's get that stuff out and run it. Let's quote restore this, we're going to paint it up like we think it ought to be. And that's okay 40 years ago, because we didn't know any better. This was a fledgling industry, preservation of railroad rolling stock was in its infancy. And in the last 40 years, we have matured. We have grown in our insight and our appreciation for the value of these pieces of equipment, and we have come to appreciate what they represent, not so much as, hey, you know, that nice old stuff that used to run, let's go sit on it and go for a ride, but we are now getting into who built it? What were they thinking of when they built it? What did they use? What materials did they have? What was their philosophy on building things? Well, I'd like to suggest that the person who built this car was an arrogant prick. This is a stupid big car. This is really a ridiculous car for the style of construction that was in it. And now I have it, and somebody expects something great out of it. And the question that I deal with is, what can I do with this piece of equipment that will not falsify history? I will not create history. What can I do that will make this car interesting to the public, that will preserve this car for a number of years, so that when smarter people come along and they know what to do with it, we'll have something to work with? So what am I going to do with it? The fact that it even exists is absolutely phenomenal. It's an old car, it's not well made, not well designed, but it was taken care of. Let's see what the next slide is. I don't remember. I put this together weeks ago. Oh yeah. So, we'll back up. So here's the first problem with these wooden cars of this nature. It has a big sag. It doesn't look like much of a sag, but it's a 50-foot long car, so that's a significant sag in it.
About 3 inches.
After we pick the car body up so it's somewhat level, there are 3 inches of clearance between the top of this truss rod bolt and the bottom of the frame. There's a little red arrow there. I don't know if you can see that. Right. Let's see. There's a. Oh no, that's the wrong button. Yeah, right in here. This is 3 inches. So from this point to where it anchors into the car is 13 feet. You can do the math. It's the rod was drawn in about 1 3/4 inches. Anyway. The nut doesn't belong at the top of this post. The nut belongs down somewhere in the middle. So the real sag is far more than that, but that's what we're looking at. You can just wander on over it and it looks pretty good. Please ignore the new iron and the white wood. We'll get to that later. So what do we do with the car? We're going to conserve the car. We're not going to restore the car. We're going to conserve the car. In other words, we're going to prevent continued deterioration. We're going to try and get into a mechanically stable situation where the car is looking like the car should look. We're going to remove everything that is not railroad, so that would be all the movie stuff and the lace curtains and the pieces of plywood and the bad Bondo that was nailed on the car. We're going to remove all the material that would attract vermin, mold, and rot. This would be the deafening sealing under the car. All of the acorns that are in the car body have to come out because they are very slowly tearing the car apart. Essentially, so I love the woodpeckers, I really do. I'm just going to kind of bounce around here because if you have any questions, Wendell has all the answers. This car was in Southern California in an area where there's a woodpecker. It's a very social woodpecker called a clown-faced or an acorn woodpecker. It makes its living by drilling holes in dead things and putting acorns in so that they can come back and either eat the acorns or eat the bugs that come up to eat the acorns. In talking to an ornithologist from USC, they have granaries. These are trees that have been around for a long time, standing dead trees. 1,000 woodpecker holes in it, 10,000 woodpecker holes, depends how big it is. These are very communal birds. They go over and they drill holes in the tree, they put an acorn in there. When the acorn is either consumed by a hungry woodpecker or it falls out, another woodpecker comes along and puts the acorn back in the hole. This car is full of acorns because it was where those woodpeckers were, and they drilled a hole in the side of the car. They put an acorn in there. It fell to the inside. It's a perfectly good hole. We got to put another acorn in there. The car filled up with acorns. The acorns settled down into the walls. Moisture comes in. They expand a little bit. And they push sideways. And they push the car apart. And then the dry season comes around, and the acorns dry out and kind of settle down. And they push and they settle, and they push and they settle. And so the acorns are pushing this car apart. So we need to take those out because it is mechanically destroying the car. It's also the only thing that galvanizes the fourth grade school class that comes to see the car. It is significant. The acorns are what make the kids, and we need to pander to the children, in my opinion. The acorns are what really get their attention. You got fourth graders, I don't know, how old's a fourth grader? 10, something like that? We go, 1868, 1868, hell, they don't know 1968. We go, they built a railroad across the land, and they joined the East and the West Railroad at Promontory with a golden spike. Big deal, you can fly to Boston in 5 hours. You can't reach, unfortunately, the young people with this kind of history. But you need to get them involved somehow. You need to inspire them to believe that museums have value when they get older. And the best way to do it, in my opinion, on this car is the acorns. The acorns, as far as telling the story of this car, are more important than the golden spike. The golden spike is academic. The acorns, that's popular press. That's what's going to get their attention. Anyway, so back to conservation. So we take the acorns out because they're destroying the car. We took the deafening ceiling out. Those are the boards that are nailed. They're not out in this photograph. These boards right here are nailed underneath the car, right in this area. They're holding all the sawdust and wood chips in that when the car was built. They were thrown in there as sound dampening or perhaps insulation against cold weather, whatever the reason was. You need to get rid of that stuff. Anyway, let's see what the next slide is. This is really exciting. So we started looking at things that are wrong with the car. This is what's wrong with the car. This is a broken end sill on the car body. It's broken by virtue of the car sagging. It's broken by virtue of bad design, poor engineering. Wendell will address this whole subject in depth. Anyway, we have no intention of repairing this at this time. But it is one of the defects that we need to document so that we can treat the car in a manner that makes this not a big deal. So the car's got a big sag in it. I was standing in Costco one day looking at the ceiling, the roof, the ceiling, and there's all these trusses inside the roof, and I was actually staring at the ceiling thinking about how many acres of space there was, of floor there was, and how 3.5 feet of wet snow, what's the load on that? Doing a little math, trying to figure out what the load on the roof was, because, you know, wet snow can be unmercifully heavy. And it occurred to me that those trusses in the roof had to actually be pretty strong. They had to be, from an engineering standpoint, they had to be sufficient to do the job, to hold up whatever snow comes in, yet there was gazillions of little bastards in there. And I thought, okay, well, they're holding the roof up, and a big snow load, but there's a lot of them. This has to be a really economical tool in the construction of buildings. Can I use this to my advantage? There's a company out in outside of Fallon, just outside of Leetville, on the way to Fallon, that builds these things. So I drove on out and I just introduced myself to the front office there, and I said, you know, I want one truss, and this is what I want to do with it, and it's not standard application, so I don't want an engineering stamp on this, but can you build me a truss to do this? And they said, oh yeah, we can do that, you bet. We build trusses, that's what our job is. So I came back and I measured off 3 feet in the car, and I counted every board. It was in the 3 feet, figured out what the weight was and the roofing material, and I said, I need to be able to support 150 pounds per linear foot of car between the kingpins in the car, and I sent it to them with my drawing. And this is my drawing that I did in AutoCAD just as a representation. I said I'm going to support it on either end, on the kingpins over the trucks, on the bolsters, and then bolt the car body up to it, and I sent it off to them, and they sent me back. This is not the design, but the one they sent back, the whole truss was 1,700 pounds, and they doubled it up, and they gave me a Witt engineering stamp for those of you that are engineers, and it's a beautiful truss. And then they went, this is such a great project, we're just going to give it to you for free. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Great. And I said, okay, and then they delivered it in a snowstorm. The truck got stuck, and I had to push them out of the ditch with a forklift. And then, anyway, there's my truss. And then here we are shoving it into the car inside the building. And it was a resounding success. It gave us a structural member between the support points. Railroad car bodies are only supported on 2 points. Even today, the entire railroad car body is only on 2 points. It's on the center pins on the trucks. Yeah, there's side bearings in case it tips to one side or another, but they are not designed to support the weight of the car. They're there to prevent the car from tipping side to side. Anyway, so we stuffed it in there. And there it is in situ before we put any of the rods into it to bolt the car body up to. I had anticipated putting in diagonal rods every 4 feet down the length of it, but it turns out that when we put these things in, these diagonal rods, you can see a couple of diagonal 2x4s in there to prevent the thing from falling over and killing somebody. That's basically the lines of the rods that are in the car now. I only needed 4 total. I went down and I straddled the needle beams under the car, tightened them up, the whole car leveled out. So it was very innovative. In other words, I did not bastardize the original structure, except for drilling holes in the floor of the car to get the rods through. And the rods come out, and then we're going to back up here. And so the rods come through here. These are the rods that are diagonally through, and they're got a couple of channel irons welded back to back, and some nice blocks in there to pick the weight of the car up and to level it out. And that's when we got this distance here. When the car was finally leveled, that's the gap we ended up with. It was really cool. Actually, I'm pretty proud of that one, to be honest with you. I really like that. Here it is, and we can see that we built this aggressive saddle on top of the girder. the truss, and then these rods go through and they're threaded, and they draw the car body up to somewhat level. Of course, the ends of the car still droop. Hadn't really planned on how to deal with that. I was going to sort of ignore that and hope it went away. It didn't. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the platforms kind of droop over badly, and because of the lens, you don't really get this feel for it, but the whole thing's tipping over a lot. Rick in the shop, I went sailing down in the Caribbean, and I said, Rick, when I come back, this is what I want. You design it. He built these members that bolted onto the truss and stuck up through the door here. And we put chain falls on, and we winched the end platforms up, and they're actually pretty square and level right now. And we can now move the car around the property, put it wherever we need to, without the fear of quite literally breaking the car in half. Let me back up here. Part of the problem with this car, and Wendell will speak to this, is that in the modifications that the V&T did to this car when they got it, they took out certain structural components. They put other structural components in that were less than satisfactory. The roof started to collapse down. The weight of the roof collapses down. It pushes out this clear story wall. It pushes out the main wall. Then the clear story deck starts to sag down. The car is almost 3 inches wider at what we call the plate. The plate is here. It's almost 3 inches wider at the plate than it is at the floor. The whole car is trying to spread itself open. So we've been sort of fiddling around with how to get it back to where it should be. And in this photograph, you can see that there's a rod with a turnbuckle on it in the original holes where those rods were. So we're not drilling holes in the car body. We're trying to be as minimally invasive as we can be on the artifact. And you can't just tighten up that turnbuckle and pull it back in because it's pulling the roof apart. So we have boards in here with jacks, and then you get into the issue of when you tighten up the turnbuckle, is it going to slide? No, it's not going to slide, damn it. So you have to get in there with jacks and pick it up on single points and sort of wobble back and forth. And we still really haven't resolved that whole issue. But we're on our way, and there's this stupid platform, yeah. Oh, and there's, here, incidentally, is some of the fruits of your labor over here. We're building lamps. We're kind of in a holding pattern right now. We're not going to fire up the foundry, and we're not doing any welding as long as that car's in the shop, because I'll tell you the truth, if I burnt that car down because of an errant spark, I would have to kill myself. And I like me. Wendell's going to talk about this. This is this is the structural truss. This is the thing that supposedly gives the body rigidity. When we build something nowadays, or as consumers, when we buy something today, we understand that it isn't going to last forever. I mean, I don't know how many of you people here buy cars. I'd imagine several of you. Anyway, we don't anticipate having that automobile for 40 years. It's just not in our mindset. That's not what we do. We may have a 40-year-old car, but the chances are we bought it 5 years ago. There's a guy over here in a big black hat just bought a 1953 Willys. I mean, he didn't buy that car in 1953 and have it today. He bought it a while ago because it was kind of cool. We don't plan for longevity in those things that we buy. I don't think the people that built this car expected it to last for a long time, especially in light of the advancements in railroad technology that was happening in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and on and on and on and on. They have a limited life. They're not supposed to last forever. That's a crappy design, poorly executed, using minimal grade material, probably by minimum bid contractors paying minimum bid wages.
On Monday.
On a Monday. So this piece right here is one of the diagonals in the wall. And so you build this whole thing probably out of green material, recently sawn material. You're going to run it through humid environments. You're going to run it through dry desert environments. The wood's going to grow. The wood's going to shrink. There's really, this is not a great design for a long length structure, given the height and the material and sundry. And so the car, as you pull with the locomotive, it kind of leans back. As you stop, it kind of leans forward. There's a rocking back and forth. And the diagonals compress the cross grain of the members they're up against. And we can, this is pretty obvious that there is, there is failure here as this diagonal member has wedged itself up in and compressed the cross grain of the, that is the girth. Thank you. Now, this car was recited at some point in time. Wendell will speak to the exact date, but it's 1911, 12, 13, I don't know, somewhere around in there. And they got inside. This is the corner that we took down to get rid of all the acorns. They realized this car was a sack of poo, and they went in, they put a little piece of wood right in here to tighten it up. And they put some angle braces in here. These are stupid. If you have something that's wobbly and you go to the hardware store, do not buy these and put them in. This is a stupid thing to do from an engineering standpoint. It's a bad idea then, it's a bad idea today. The V&T recognized that this was an issue. Here are the guys trying to tighten the car frame up by driving little wedges in here and there. We can see this area was completely filled with, it was packed with acorns. You can see dry rot down in this area, mold over in this area. This is the truss plank. This is the side sill. There's an interesting little cut right down in here that I haven't figured out what that's all about. That's a buried cross rod. Wendell will speak to that. It's a horrible construction. This car should have died a long time ago. Anyway, oh, that's a close-up of that little piece of wood. I forgot I did that there. The V&T also took out all those little turnbuckle-y things that I'm putting back in, and then they put in iron carlins. This is, we're looking at the side of the clear story. This is a clear story from the inside. They put in these iron carlins. They cut this deck plate. This is the deck sill. All right, who's the brainiac out there? Correct me earlier. Is it deck sill? Is that a deck sill?
Plate, deck plate.
Deck plate. That's a deck plate. Yeah. Anyway, they cut them in 3 places, and then put this plate over the top of it with some flat-headed wood screws in there, and that was it. And then one of the hammer welds on one of these things broke in the car, so now we're down to 2 instead of 3. This car apparently was paneled in California laurel. There's an interesting write-up in Wooden Boat magazine about 2 years ago about California laurel. It's really kind of a cool write-up. I've never really seen it. I'm going to believe this is California laurel because we took one of these panels out, and the number of nail holes in the panel matched the number of nail holes in the framing, meaning it's the first nailing. It kind of looks like, to be honest with you, it kind of looks like white pine. I mean, it looks like a vertical grain white pine, clear white pine. I don't know. So who knows? It could be white pine and they just advertise it as laurel. I will tell you right now that as far as McCain was concerned, Cuban mahogany, which our car was purportedly finished in, is actually stained poplar. Anyway, this piece of wood right here, this one from wood, that's kind of a cool piece. I don't know what that is. That's another piece of wood. Here's the side sill. Nice growth rings. I don't know why I thought this was important when I was putting it together. Just a nice piece of wood. We'll look at the top of the side sill in this area. And this is the truss plank. Look how close together those growth rings are. That's a beautiful board. Whoever restores this car is going to have a hell of a time finding a stick of wood like that 50 feet long. So, in my work, what I have done, I'm kind of pleased with this. This is the later siding with the V&T put on. These white circles represent where they're nailed off in the face. There's a row of nail holes right here, right in this area. It's a lousy piece of iron. Those nails, these nails right here in the middle, are brittle. They exhibit what's called hot shortness. Probably a cottage home industry nail. They're not dimensionally very good. They're just broken off at the top. When they stripped the siding off, these things just broke off right there. Terrible, terrible iron. Very early, probably bog iron. So I went through and I looked at all these, and I have circled in this photograph all the centers on all the nails, and I did 10 of them. I don't know how many's here, and I'm not going to count them. But one of you tech weenies can go ahead and count this and tell me how there. And then I divided by 10, and I came up with 2 11/16 inch wide siding. So we can pretend, because I can't prove it, that these are original nail holes for original siding by the CP in 1868. If you were going to build a car, you might go, I have this big wooden thing, I need to cover the whole thing in wood, send me a whole bunch of it. Would they necessarily make special boards for the sides and special boards for the roofs, special boards for the floor? Yeah, I don't think so. I think they just sent over a whole crap load of 2 11/16 wide siding. I wonder where else we could find that. Hang on here. Technology, keep checking stuff up. So this is 2 11/16 wide redwood siding with a little bead right here, little bead right there. Redwood, vertical grain red, oh, beautiful redwood. This is under the duckbill of the clear story. This is where the clear story sort of blends into the end of the car. We took the end panels down to look there because chances are they never removed the clear story. So my argument is that given the width of this material, the fact that it was probably never disturbed, it's probably also what the car was sided in. There is no paint on this. So we still don't know what color the car was. I think that's the end of it. Yeah, that's the end of it. Anyway, that's what I've done. And then Wendell has all the rest of the answers. And so when the lights go out, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm going to try and slither out. So if there are any questions, save them for me. Now's the time to answer. None? Thank you. No?
You were well comprehensive.
Here. Here. I'm on, and I realize that everybody wants to go.
the first part really is intended as history. Can you hear me all right?
No.
Put it in the middle.
What do I do? Is it not on? Hello, hello. Oh, I can hear myself. That's good. Okay. The purpose of this newspaper article is really just to show you that Charles Crocker was credited with the construction of this car for his benefit. Basically, he wanted a Winnebago on rails. It made a lot of sense. This was July of 1868. At that time, the end of the railroad was Wadsworth. They had a lot of country to cover, a long ways from hotels and lodging. It was called Crocker's car from the very beginning. It's identified as Crocker's car in the invoices for the materials being bought for the car. But for the first 5 months, it was used to carry inspectors that were commissioned by the federal government to go out and inspect the railroad, for which reason it was often called the commissioner's car. This is taken, we believe, in Argenta, Nevada, in March. It can be cold, and you can see the buffalo robe that these guys were bundled up under, sitting on the pilot deck. That's one of those Danforths with the arch windows, I do believe. In May of 1869, it shows up at Promontory, and very soon thereafter, Crocker begins to use it for taking trips back to the east. This is a picture of it on the Union Pacific, and Crocker's car is this one out here in the sort of front. It's actually the best picture we have of that car in its Central Pacific period. The things to notice in particular, the window tops are square, or they're flat across, and the row of sill tie rods along at the bottom. Roof vents change fairly frequently, but there's 2 lamp vents in the top. This is the kitchen vent. These things change around pretty much with the weather. A year later, the car ends up in Reno. This is June of 1870. The bad news is it's 20 years before we have another picture of this car. And a number of things happen between now and then. But before I leave this, notice that the windows are still, they're square at the top. The window sills only extend underneath each window. They don't run the entire length of the car. It still has the sill tie rods along the bottom. The next year, the car went to the shop. I suspect that's when it got air brakes. We do not know for sure. Also in 1871, Crocker retired from the railroad. So this car is sort of kicking around now without a sponsor. Same year, this car is reported carrying a fellow named Alfred Cohen to New York. And later that year, the Central Pacific builds a new director's car. In 1875, Cohen is identified as the owner of a car. Actually, at that time, William Sharon was the passenger in it that was said to be Cohen's car. At the end of 1875, Cohen sells the car, and it comes to Virginia. It comes to Carson City. The interesting thing is that at the time it comes up here in 1875, they're doing some repair work to the car at Carson City. They order materials from the shops in Sacramento. The Central Pacific Railroad is still identifying it as Crocker's car. This is one of the documents that ties the B&T car back to Promontory. It's also described as Crocker's car in a newspaper, and one of the other newspapers describes it as a car that was built for the bigwigs on the Central Pacific. So there's a number of connections that connect the B&T car. The problem is we don't know who bought the car. We don't know if it was Yarrington, we don't know if it was Sharon, we don't know if it was the B&T. Finally, in 1890, the 2/3 of the car shows up on a train on the bridge. It's the last car on this train. There's a close-up of it. We can see that it now has arched top windows. It has a letterboard. The vents are different. And I believe it now has 3 lights, 3 lamps down the roof, but it's really pretty iffy on that one. Between 1903, when locomotive 22 got its sunflower stack, In 1910, when it became an oil burner, Stanley Palmer took this picture of the train in Reno. The car is car 17. The thing to notice here is that it still has these sill tie rods. Keep your eye on those because they disappear. This picture is 1916, the sill tie rods are gone. The VNT has attempted to modernize the car. As it turns out, every time they tried to modernize this thing, they crippled the car just a little bit more. Finally, in the 1930s, the rail fans show up and begin to take pictures of the car rather than trains with the car in it. The car had not been painted for 14 years. When they started running mixed trains to Virginia City, this car sat. The VNT at that point basically wasn't doing anything with it. Its last act on the VNT was bringing up the end of a railfan trip in June of 1938. This was probably the last time that it ever carried paying passengers. After that, you had to be paid to be in the car. And that's because it went to Hollywood and there were actors in it. 20th Century Fox got the car in September of '38. They wanted the seats. They built a set on a soundstage in a studio in Los Angeles. So all that you see from coach 17 here are the seats and the luggage racks. And if you look at the walls, you can tell this is not a railroad car. The VNT would not sell the car to 20th Century Fox. I don't know why. I would love to think that they wanted to preserve it. But in any event, 20th Century Fox contacted the railroad 12 months later and said, golly shucks, we wrecked the car. It's destroyed. What do we owe you for it? And that's how 20th Century Fox became the owner of this car. It in fact had not been damaged at all, but the movie industry is into make-believe, so that's how that kind of stuff happens. 20th Century Fox had the car for 39 years. I know of only 4 movies that it was in, and most of those are just instants. This, I believe, is from Centennial Summer, and I do believe that this car was in that very, very briefly. The beautiful thing about this car being in Centennial Summer, which, by the way, I'm sure you've never seen, it's a terrible movie. The only people that ever bothered were relatives of the actors. But the movie is about this 1876 Centennial in Philadelphia, and this car was actually at Philadelphia on 2 trips for the Centennial. So I think there's a great irony that I'm sure is missed by everybody. The only good thing about that movie is that Walter Brennan is in it and has absolutely no accent whatsoever. About 1960, 20th Century Fox moved the car out to Malibu Canyon. This is just around the corner from where they filmed MASH, in case that mountain in the background looks like the mountain in Korea in MASH. This is the way the car looked when Shortline Enterprises bought it in 1973. They discovered that the roof was collapsing, and so they propped it up with 2x4s. They probably did not know that the underframe was already broken. And all they're doing is loading up the broken underframe here. If you look at those seats in the background, they appear to be pitching toward the center of the car. It's because there's a lateral sag across the car. This does give you a sense of what the interior of the car looked like on the VNT. We believe that the siding, the laurel in this, does go back to 1868. The VNT apparently made it a very light color and grained it. And this is probably the same color that it was on the VNT because I'm sure the studios didn't do anything to it. Well, I'm not sure of that, but what are you gonna do? Shortline Enterprises took it to Alta Loma, and then they took it up to Jamestown. And they discovered that the car had been attacked by gremlins. That is one of the gremlins in the foreground. In the late 70s, Kenny Rogers comes along and he's going to make a movie called Kenny Rogers as the Gambler because of the song that he did. They needed 2 trains. They were shooting a train in Old Tucson and they were shooting a train in Jamestown. And the trains needed to match so the viewers did not realize there were different trains. And the only car that Shortline Enterprises had that matched what they had in Old Tucson was car 17. That, if nothing else, prolonged the life of this car. It may very well have saved the life of this car. They spent quite a bit of effort on the inside propping up the roof more the way they should. They did paint it a nice dark color for some reason. But anyway, good work from Shortline Enterprises. They also repaired one end of the car where it was falling apart with dry rot. This is what it looked like in Kenny Rogers as the Gambler. A couple years later, they painted it green, hoping to attract some business. And then in 1983, they lettered it for the Denver and California Western for Kenny Rogers as the Gambler. The adventure continues, and then it was used in 1984 in Pale Rider, which was its last movie. Both of those were under Shortline Enterprises. This paint job is the paint job that's still on the car. It has been on the car longer than any other paint job has ever been on it. The museum bought the car in 1988, brought it up from Jamestown, stuffed it into the Interpretive Center before the Interpretive Center was open, and in 2015, we drug it out to daylight for the first time in a quarter of a century so that the guys doing the feasibility study could see the car under sunlight. You can see the sag. Obviously, the question for us here, the reason we did the feasibility study was because the 150th anniversary is coming along. It's like, what is feasible to do with this car? What's appropriate? What can we do with it? The only thing that most people knew that was significant about the car was the fact that it had been a promontory in 1869. Whenever anybody would come to the museum that was interested, I would show them the car, and of course I would tell them this story. I didn't know there was anything more interesting. They always knew there was something more interesting because they always looked at the woodpecker holes. One day I walked into the shop and I discovered that Chris had started taking siding off the side of the thing. One question that had sort of bothered me all along was, why does this car from 1868 sag so much more than Coach 8, which is built 1869, or Combine 15 that was built in 1874. Those cars are still rather straight, and they're shorter, but there must have been something different. So I started looking at this truss. This is called a bastard Howe. The bastard means illegitimate. In the true Howe truss, the diagonal braces go clear to the top plate. And in this, the weight of the load is transferred to the plate by rods. They're vertical rods. And then it comes down this brace to the bolsters, which rides on the truss. The purpose of the truss is to move the load toward the end of the car. Problem is, in a passenger car with that row of windows, you can't run the braces all the way to the top. So in this car, the load goes up on this rod, comes down on this post to the belt rail, and then leans on the braces. And as Chris showed you before, those braces have dug into the wood every time the car leaned on it. And over the years, it kept leaning more and more, and eventually that's how the car started to sag. At that point, everything is still working. What happens is some smart car builder comes along and says, there's a sag in this car, we gotta get rid of it. So they level it. The problem is, at that point, all of these joints open up. At this point, the truss is doing absolutely nothing. All the load is now being carried on the truss rods. There's a simple solution to that, and it's called the brace straining rod. It's this rod right here. This is Coach 3. This is built 1872, so this is only 4 years newer than Coach 17. In this, the load comes from the sill up to the top of the brace and then down the brace. It doesn't bother going clear up to the plate. And the nice thing about this is a guy can come along with a wrench and tighten the nut at the bottom of that thing and keep the truss tight. So in this car, and if you look at Coach 3, even though it's in deplorable condition above the windows, the car is actually pretty level, and it's because it had a much better wall truss system. This is Coach 16 over in Sacramento when they were reciting it. This car has what's called a compression arch. Again, it's a great solution. It makes those wall truss stay stable for a long, long time. This is 1874. Okay, why didn't they do that in Coach 17, Crocker's car? The obvious answer is nobody knew about those things yet. These things come along just about 1870, and I think the reason for that, the bastard Howe truss that was in those passenger cars was developed in 1840. Those cars built in 1840 were starting to fall apart, in 1870, and people said there has to be a better way to do it. Benjamin Welch is the guy that built the Crocker car. He built the best car he knew how to do, even though it does look an awful lot like Bob Newhart with a beard. The problem is, when he built the Crocker car, he had only built 6 kits. He had not built a passenger car from scratch. He had built these kits that were imported from the Central Pacific from the East Coast. And I believe that Welch merely took the design from this car and stretched it by 7 feet to get 3 more windows in it to accommodate all of the stuff that Crocker wanted in his Winnebago. There are a lot of similarities between this and Coach 17. The truss rod system with a single clean post. This has the sill tie rods coming through the ends. He went modern. He used individual board siding, whereas this is a board and back. And of course, he did put clerestory on that. And I'll talk about the clerestory in a little bit. One thing he did, terrible picture because I blew it up, but these kits were cross-eyed. You look, those windows are right next to the door. He repeated that same pattern in Coach 17. This is just one more piece of evidence to me that he's merely taking the older car and stretching it. The one thing he did do to support the extra length was he added 2 more truss rods. Most passenger cars only have 2 truss rods. This car has 4. What he did, though, was the center 2 truss rods are on a needle beam that does not extend from side to side. The needle beam only extends from the intermediate sills to the other intermediate sill. The only lateral support in this car are those sill tie rods that runs all the way through it, side to side. This is the needle beam under Coach 17. It only extends from here to over here. This is one of the truss rods. 1870, 1871, somewhere in there they go and put air brakes under the car. Didn't have air brakes before that. To do that, to get the linkage in there, they actually had to carve part of the needle beam away. Suddenly this truss rod is raised about 4 inches above what it should be. That weakens this truss rod considerably, and now basically the car is only being held up by 3 truss rods. When they re-side the car in 1912, they buried the end of those sill tie rods. They drill a hole and recess those nuts, and then they bury that under the siding. So at this point, you no longer can tighten up the sill tie rods. So the floor begins to move independently of the walls. Not really a very good thing. This is a picture from the 1930s, and again, these seats are leaning toward the center of the car. By the 1930s, the floor had already begun to sag in the middle because of that weakened system. I have a feeling that the floor bouncing up and down may have had something to do with breaking that end sill. Over the course of time, those middle truss rods are doing less and less work. More and more of the weight is on the side sills. We know that the side sills are not being supported by the wall trusses. They're being supported entirely by those 2 outside truss rods, and they get pushed down faster and faster, and they keep correcting it. And this is the clean post on one side. The clean post on these cars are literally jacks. This screw, from the original photographs, this nut was clear down here. There's about 8 inches of sag over the course of that car's life. And now you can see that this clean post is entirely outside. By the way, when this nut is down here, and that nut is pushing against the bottom of the sill, all this threaded material is stuck up in a hole that goes right through the side sill. The idea of drilling a 2-inch diameter hole in the middle of a 5-inch wide structural member just sort of strikes me as like, you gotta be kidding. It's not in the middle of a span, but nevertheless you wonder. On the other side, the clean posts are longer, and I have a feeling this side began to sag while it was still on the B&T, and they extended those things. I don't think this is something that the studios would have done. So that's the car with the sag. The sag basically is going in one direction. The only way to fix it is to re-anchor the truss rods. This is the point of failure right here. This is the end of the truss rod. This extends on down to the clean post toward the center of the car. They just were bolted. There was a little finger that went up into a mortise inside of the side sill, and then these two bolts that went through the side sill. This is what anchored, and in the end, this is what the entire car is hanging on. That's ripped out, it's torn out this piece of wood. You could continue to load this thing, and that would just continue to move, and there's just no way around it. All right, quickly, clear stories. The one thing that Welsh did that was cutting edge was he put a clear story on that car. The clear story was first put on a passenger car in late 1859. They began to be adopted in the early 1860s. The early clear stories we believe were like this were called monitor roof, not the type of the clear story that we see on our cars or like you see on the car next to it there. For some reason in 1867, Huntington wrote a letter from New York to his partners in California and said any new passenger cars you build need to have a clear story. He doesn't explain why. I think it's because he found out that the California Pacific had ordered cars with clear stories, and he knew that the two railroads were going to be in competition, and he thought we'd better do the right thing. They seem to have not known what a clear story was, and they said, send us drawings. We do not know that this is the drawing that he sent. This is a drawing of a car built in 1867. It has a really strange end to the clear story. It's a type of duck bill, but apparently there's no windows, there's just the vents, and this very abrupt ramp-like approach at the very end. The reason I find that very interesting, and also the coincidence of it being 1867, is this picture that Hart took before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and this clear story here in the foreground looks very much like we saw in that drawing. The idea of building a clear story without windows just sort of is crazy. But anyway, there it is. This is Crocker's car back here. That's the third clear story that Welsh built. The problem with the clear story is keeping it up there. It destroys the integrity of the roof to put a clear story in place. The old arch-top cars had these carlins that ran from wall to wall. It was a pretty good system. This is one of the monitor roofs. You can see in this, they continue to run some kind of carlin apparently clear across the car. And so you don't get the open space that the clear story can give you, but at least you keep it up there. This is a Silver Palace car. There's these interesting poles between each seat. They probably have something to do with the bunks, but I suspect that is what's holding up the clear story in the Silver Palace car. When we took the paneling off the inside of the clear story in 17, we discovered these holes, as Chris pointed out, and we pretty much recognized that originally there were rods across there that kept the roof from spreading. Great system, probably would have worked. We don't know what it looked like in the car. Was it hidden under a piece of wood? Was it hidden under decoration? We don't know. Other cars have these things across the clear story. The one thing we do not have is a photograph of Crocker's car to show us what the roof was like. The solution to the clear story was the steel or iron profile carlin. This threads from wall to wall, but it follows the cross-section profile of the carlin. And this supports the carlin, or the clear story, but it leaves it open inside and makes everybody happy. This is a profile carlin in coach 18. You can see it up here. It was exposed by the fire. There's 6 of them in this car, 50 foot long. When the V&T decided to modernize, again, coach 17 by putting in these carlins and taking out the rods, they only put 3 of those things in. Chris showed you this element right here. It went in 2 pieces, got bolted together. You can see right here is the hole in the Central Pacific lamp. Which dates this. It tells us this went in after the Central Pacific lamp came out. Once this was in place, the V&T put their lamp in here. Didn't bother them a bit that they cut through a rafter. They did that in 2 locations. They put 3 of these in. Every one of these, as they pointed out, as Chris pointed out, cut the deck plate into sections and basically crippled the roof. At this point, the roof is starting to fall in. Shoreline Enterprises caught that in time and saved it. Otherwise, this car probably would have looked a lot more like Coach 3. This is the car today. It's a patchwork quilt of stories. This area right here is 1868. You can see the side of the side sill, that's 1868. The interior paneling is probably 1868. Maybe 3 of the 4 truss rods are 1868. Maybe the end railing, we do not know. The needle beams were 1868, but they got butchered in probably 1871. The windows at some point were changed from a square top to a round top. Someone put a letterboard on it. The vents have been changed at some point in time. The platform sill was changed in 1906. That's probably when they changed the steps from just individual steps hanging to these with these the sideboards. The trucks are V&T trucks, probably after 1878. The couplers are 1902. There's just a whole lot of stuff on this car. The woodpecker holes are 1965. If we restored this car, we'd lose all of that. Right now, you can stand next to the car and I can tell you the story of the trusses. We can go inside and you can see the story, the sequence of how they modernized the clear story and came close to destroying the car in the process. If you really want to know what we're going to do with the car, come back in a year. We keep talking about different ways to present it. The challenge is how to tell all these stories in an exciting way. You walk into a museum now and you see all those fancy restorations and you get really excited and think this is really cool. It takes you back in time. What we're doing with this is showing this car coming through time up to the present. And there's a lot to tell people in this car. There's a lot to tell people about how railroads were continually dinking with this stuff to keep it profitable and keep it rolling. So anyway, that's my story.
It's hard.
Do you have any questions for Wendell? All right, hopefully next year, after the Sunday of after the conference, we will be able to go over to the museum and Wendell will give you a first-hand account of this car. Chris will be hiding in the back room. I want to thank both Chris and Wendell for coming.